I had used the flash to take a photo yesterday, and apparently the flash was still on, but when you're recording, it just stays on and goes right into your retina. So Good morning again, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome back to Unity of Metairie. I'm just going to leave these up here. It doesn't matter to me that you all look like a Monet painting to me right now. I can still tell who you are. So today, my subject is, you are not your emotions. Now, when we're growing up, I mean, people have different experiences in how we were taught or not taught to handle difficult emotions specifically. And positive emotions versus negative emotions, and how boys are taught differently than girls, and girls are taught differently than boys. There's been a lot of talk recently about the terms toxic positivity and toxic masculinity. And when we talk about toxic masculinity, a lot of that has to do with how often, not always, but very often, little boys are taught, boys don't cry. Pretty much often they're taught that the only emotions that are okay for them to express are anger. They can be happy, but everything else is like, they can't cry because that's like a girly emotion. And then on the flip side, girls are not allowed to be angry. They always have to be happy and people pleasing and be ladylike, which basically means, not overshowing anything. So there can be a lot of dysfunction about how we're taught to handle our emotions when they come up. Another thing I'm going to get into is emotions and feelings. Those two words are often used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Our emotions are neurological reactions to external stimuli. This is like our instinct. They're unconscious. You have no control over the emotions that come up. And it's a physical response. It's a response in your brain. And these are objective. They happen to everybody. Feelings are our perception of and the meaning that we assign to the emotional experience that we're having. This is completely subjective, and basically our feelings are formed by what we think about our emotions. Fun fact, just because it's fun, the word emotion, it comes from two ancient sources. The Latin, I think it's emovere, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which means to move out, remove, or agitate. And the Old French, émouvoir, which means to stir up. Now, especially when we're talking about difficult emotions, like when something happens that makes you mad or scares the bejesus out of you, that definitely stirs things up. You get a hit of adrenaline. And especially with scary things, you get that fight or flight response. A lot of you have probably heard of the fight or flight, or fight, flight, or freeze. Those are like the three things that we will typically do when faced with that kind of a situation. Are you gonna fight? Are you gonna run away? Or are you just gonna be like, I don't know what to do, so I will do nothing. And interesting, into the neurological bit of this, there is a lady called Dr. Jill, I think it's Bolt. There's an E at the end. I'm not sure whether to pronounce the E or not. I won't. Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor. And she is a Harvard brain scientist, or specifically a brain anatomist. So she studies the anatomy of the brain and what it actually does. And she, in her book called, I think it's From Whole Brain Living, she calls it the 90-second rule. And this is her quote from the book. When a person has a reaction to something in their environment, there is a 90-second chemical process that happens. Any remaining emotional response is just the person choosing to stay in that emotional loop. Now, of course, that last part sounds a little bit judgy, but it's really not. Basically, what that means is that when you react to a stimulus in your environment, like, as I was talking, something that scares you or makes you angry, there's a 90-second process where your brain sends a signal and the stress hormones are released into your body to stimulate this fight or flight response. After the 90 seconds, those stress hormones typically are flushed out, but any remaining emotional response is caused by you hanging on to the thoughts, the ruminating thoughts, and ruminating over the event, which keeps creating the ongoing physiological response. So basically, the body stops producing stress hormones after the 90 seconds, but only if we are able to pull our thoughts away from what just happened. This is another direct quote from her. After the 90 seconds, if you continue to feel fear, anger, so on and so forth, you need to look at the thoughts that you're thinking that are re-stimulating the circuitry that's resulting in you having this physiological response over and over again. That's why people with generalized anxiety disorder can send themselves into this fight or flight response just by thinking about something that happened. Not necessarily something that's happening right now in front of them, but something that happened before they start thinking about it. And there have been studies on the brain that basically prove that your brain, when it's processing this information, can't tell the difference between something that you're thinking about that happened and is done that isn't actually happening in front of you and something that is actually happening right now. They've done it with like less stressful things where somebody was like watching live a ballet, either live or watching it on TV, and then they were asked to think about, like, remember it, and the processing in the brain was exactly the same for when they were watching it and for when they were remembering it. So it's crazy that our brains, amazing as they are, don't know the difference. So it's important that we examine these thoughts as they're happening. So after the 90 seconds, like, check in with yourself. See what you're thinking, especially if you're still not feeling right. Because our emotions themselves, they're not good or bad. They just are. It's a neurological reaction that happens. It's our reaction to them that can be good or bad, especially for our health, especially when we're talking about anxiety. So that's where emotional intelligence comes in. Sometimes it's referred to as EQ. It's the ability to understand and manage or regulate your own emotions. And sometimes those of other people around you. So when we talk about managing ourselves, we're really not managing the emotional response. We're managing our thoughts and our reactions to the emotional response. Managing others, it's kind of like when somebody says, oh, I shouldn't have said that, sorry, I read the room wrong, When you're paying attention to social cues and deciding whether it's really appropriate to say something, or when somebody's upset, understanding that they're upset, and then maybe trying not to say anything that would make them more upset, maybe trying to say things to calm them down. People on the autism spectrum often have a problem with this in general because they just don't get social cues at all. And depending on how their autism manifests, sometimes they'll look at your face and they can't even tell what kind of a face you're making. They don't know the difference between a happy or a sad face, or an angry face, or a constipated face. Like they have no clue. Even when they're looking at themselves in the mirror, they don't. There's a lack of connection between what the face is and what it actually means. So they can't always tell how other people might be feeling. Often, I can give you a couple of examples of TV shows, not necessarily The Good Doctor, because I don't watch that one, but but a funny one was Big Bang Theory, and a slightly more serious one was an old one called Bones. And both of the lead characters, Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory, he was very clearly on the autism spectrum, even though they never actually spoke about it. And he almost never had a clue what was going on. He didn't understand sarcasm, which is typical. And he kind of started to get to understand sarcasm, but not really. He would still always have to ask, is that sarcasm? Yes, it was, Sheldon. And in Bones, the lead character was a forensic anthropologist who had a lot of the same Sheldon Cooper characteristics. And but she was also able to catch on a lot more. Her character was. And also, just to put that out there, one of the things that they explored with these two characters is that they did have feelings and they did have emotions, and they felt feelings and emotions, which I think a lot of people don't realize about people on the autism spectrum. They think that they're like cold, and because they don't recognize emotions, they don't have them, but they really do. And sometimes they feel them even more intensely. They just have no idea how to express it or what to do. Now, when we aren't taught to regulate our behavior as it pertains to our reactions to emotions in a way that's helpful, we often start to attach our emotional experiences to our identity. We begin to believe that we are what we're feeling. And a lot of that has to do with language. I'm big on using correct language when you're talking about something. My last talk, I was talking about how we should try not to say, I can't do this, and start saying, I don't do this, because it gives you the power, and it makes it something that you are choosing and not something that's happening to you. Well, here, a lot of the times, especially in the English language, we just say, I am angry, or I am afraid. And interestingly enough, in other languages like French and Spanish, those are the two I know the most, when they say they are a particular thing, it means something completely different. They don't say they are the feeling. They say they have a feeling. So instead of referring to it as I am angry, start thinking of it as I'm feeling angry, or I feel anger, or this is anger that I'm feeling. And not I am afraid, but I feel fear, or this is fear that I'm feeling. Because our emotions, they're things that we are experiencing. They're things that we experience. They're not who we are. As the title says, you are not your emotions. Emotions are things that happen. And believing that you are your emotions, it's an unhelpful way of thinking, known as a cognitive distortion. It's part of an illusion that's been created by all of the things that you've learned or been taught since birth. Things that were taught by parents, or taught by society, or taught in school by our teachers, taught in church and our various religions. And there's a great book, you may have heard of it, by Don Miguel Ruiz, called The Four Agreements. And it goes into this illusion. And no doubt it is a spiritual book, but it really deals a lot with psychology and thinking and the way our minds work. This illusion, the ancient Toltecs, that Don Miguel Ruiz refers to in the book, they called this illusion mitote. And it is described as a fog that's made up of all of our experiences that prevents us from seeing what we really are. The agreements are all of the things that we've been taught. And basically, if we go along with them and believe them, we're agreeing to them. But all these agreements we've made and accepted, that's what forms this fog. And it can be very thick, and it can be very hard to see through. And it also feeds that illusion that we are all separate from each other.
What was that book again?
The Four Agreements.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to get it, like the actual book,
Yes, ma'am.
they have it at Five Below.
Okay.
I think it was, the last time I was over at the one that's on Vex.
Okay.
They have it over there. That's where I got my copy too. Now, in truth, our emotions are just signals. Signals that tell us that we're in need of something, that we have some sort of an unmet need. Sometimes it means we need to run away. Sometimes it means we need to enforce or establish a boundary. And sometimes you just need to laugh really, really hard and for a really long time. But learning how to separate ourselves or the self from our emotional experience is an important key to processing our emotions in a much more helpful way. Learning that it's okay to feel your emotions, all of your emotions, because we can't control them, they happen. They're automatic physiological responses to events. So we can't control them, but we can learn to identify them. Identifying them is super important because not only often are we taught to repress certain emotions, we're never taught to even know what it is that we're feeling. But if we can learn to identify it, then it will be a little bit easier for us to regulate how we respond to them. Now, even psychologists refer to emotions as positive or negative. But so-called negative emotions, they're not necessarily bad. They're just something that happens, but they can be really uncomfortable. If you've never learned to just sit with what you're feeling or really identify them, as I was saying, it can be really easy to revert to stuffing them back down so that you don't have to feel the discomfort. If you've ever had an anxiety attack or had any sort of anxiety, it can be super uncomfortable, and you might want to just sort of like swoosh it away so that you don't have to feel that. But that just means often it can just boil back up. Suppressing your emotions is always, in general, a bad idea because it prevents us from learning what this unmet need is. What is this feeling what is this emotion? What is this response? What do I need to do here? The stuffed emotion can also bubble up and boil over later on, often at completely inappropriate times. It can also become housed in our physical body, and that can make us sick. That was something I talked with my therapist about, is a lot of the times I feel like my anxiety is coming from my body, not necessarily from thoughts that I'm having. So it's important to deal with the whole thing, mind, body, spirit. Meditation can help, especially if we are the type of person who keeps engaging with the thoughts that elicit the emotional responses. Meditation can help us learn to identify recurring thoughts without actually engaging with them. And that can help us let go of a past emotional experience instead of continuing to relive it. It does take practice. It's easier said than done, but while you're meditating, you can think of your thoughts or imagine them, if you are able, as like a bus or a taxi or a streetcar, something that comes along and then goes. And you can imagine the thought is coming up, we'll just say it's a bus, and the bus comes along with this thought, and you look at it and go, okay, this thought is about such and such, but you don't get on the bus. You leave it there and then let it move along. Again, it takes practice to not engage with the thoughts. And just also practice sitting with your emotions, whatever it is you're feeling, especially if it's uncomfortable. When they're actually happening, feel them. Let them come. Uncomfortable, comfortable, just let them come. And practice identifying the emotion. What is it that you are feeling? And remember that the language is important. You are feeling this. You aren't this. It's not I am angry. It's, okay, I'm feeling anger. This is anger. You're not an angry person. You are a person who is feeling angry at that moment. And then try to figure out what this emotion is trying to tell you. What is the need that it's trying to tell you? What is it that you need to do? And then what is a more helpful way of expressing or coping with this emotion? And that you may need to find a therapist or a counselor to help you with that. Because if you've never done that before, it can be very difficult to try to do it on your own. So, I mean, definitely talk to a professional and they can help you figure these things out and give you lots of great coping mechanisms that you can latch onto. Talking about, especially with anxiety, I keep going back to that because I have experience with it. Anxiety is something you really, really feel in your body. And one of the things that I talked with my therapist about, I had about a couple of years ago, a couple of weeks of really, really, it was like a never-ending anxiety attack, like constant. It affected my sleep, it affected my digestion, it affected me wanting to eat, it affected my gag reflex. I had trouble brushing my teeth because it would make me throw up. That's how intense this anxiety was. And I kept feeling that I needed to cry. Like I was always on the verge, but it never came. And I felt like if I could just like unload and melt down, that I would feel better. And it never came. And after it turned out that it was mostly because of this job that I had taken. After I was no longer at that job, it took me almost 2 weeks to recover and to get back to normal homeostasis. And then I did end up seeking the help of a therapist. And what she told me was, when you start to feel it in your body, she's like, the next time you start to feel that, she's like, go out, do something. Go up and down a bunch of stairs. Go walk really fast. Just go do something physical. Do a bunch of jumping jacks. Do some push-ups, because you need to get that out of your body. Because that kind of, even if it's not super intense, that kind of low-grade anxiety, if it's always there in the background, it affects your hormone levels, and it wreaks havoc on your body, your organs, and how they function. And it's so physically bad for you, in addition to being mentally bad for you. So you have to not only work on your thoughts, but you have to get moving. You have to, it's mind, body, spirit, it's all connected. And so I will close with the summary. Emotions are not good or bad, and we are allowed to experience all of them. In fact, it's important that we experience them so that we know what they are and that we can learn how to let them go. It's our reaction to them and what we think about them. But that is something that we can choose. Even if it doesn't feel like it because you never learned how, it just takes practice. You can learn. These are things, coping skills that you can learn. And I encourage you to seek any help that you need in learning. Namaste and happy Sunday, y'all. Thank you for joining us.